me! Nicolas Maduro had his chance until he didn't.
Venezuela has the largest oil reserves
in the world. Venezuela, on paper, has more than 300 billion barrels of oil, or roughly 17% of the world's known oil reserve.
On January 3rd, 2026, at exactly 2 o'clock local time, the city of Caracas didn't just go to sleep. It died. There was no explosion. There were no sirens. 1 second, 3 million people had electricity. The next second, the entire Venezuelan power grid, from the Guri Dam to the Miraflores Palace, flatlined. This wasn't a malfunction, it was the opening salvo of Operation Absolute Resolve. While the city plunged into darkness, the sky above the Caribbean lit up with the invisible signatures of the most advanced air armada in history. US Cyber Command had executed a zero-day exploit on the Chinese-built grid infrastructure, blinding the Venezuelan military's command and control. And in that moment of blindness, the hammer fell. It started with the suppression of enemy air defense, SEAD. For a decade, we were told Venezuela was a fortress. We were told their Russian S-300 missile batteries and Chinese JY-27A stealth-killing radars made them untouchable. But at 2:05 a.m., B-21 raiders, flying unseen at 50,000 feet, dropped a synchronized volley of guided munitions. The S-300s didn't even turn on their radars before they were vaporized. The Chinese tracking stations on the coast were blinded by electronic warfare jamming so intense it disrupted commercial flights in Colombia. With the skies cleared, the air corridor opened. Dozens of MH-60 Blackhawks and CH-47 Chinooks, flying nap of the earth under the cover of the blackout, surged from the USS Iwo Jima off the coast. Their target wasn't the oil fields, not yet. Their target was Fuerte Tiuna, the military fortress in the heart of Caracas. Delta Force operators fast roped onto the roof of the dictator's compound. The firefight lasted 14 minutes. By 2:30 a.m., Nicolas Maduro, the man who defied Washington for a decade, was zip-tied in the back of a helicopter, flying north to a federal prison cell in New York. But while the world watched the raid on TV, the real operation was happening 200 miles to the east. Under the cover of the chaos in the capital, the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit executed an amphibious landing at the Jose Terminal. This is the most important piece of real estate in the Western Hemisphere. It is the only port capable of processing Venezuela's heavy crude oil. The Marines didn't destroy it. They didn't bomb it. They seized it. Engineers from Halliburton and KBR landed right behind the Marines. They weren't there to fight. They were there to inspect the valves, check the pipelines, and ensure the flow of black gold could be redirected from Beijing to Houston within 48 hours. The headlines told you this was a liberation, but if you looked at the tactical map, it looked exactly like a bank heist. The US military neutralized the guards, cut the alarm, and secured the vault. The vault holds 303 billion barrels of oil, and the bank robber just became the new branch manager. We are watching the first resource war of the Great Reset, and while the news talks about freedom and human rights, the real story is about heavy crude and sovereign debt. The prize is the biggest tank in the world. To understand why Marines are currently securing oil fields in the Orinoco Belt, you have to understand the geology. Venezuela is not just another oil country, it is the oil country. It holds 303 billion barrels of proven reserves. That is more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than the United States. It is the largest battery of energy on the face of the earth. But for the last 20 years, that battery was disconnected from the US power grid. Under Hugo Chavez and then Maduro, Venezuela drifted into the orbit of United States enemies. They sold their oil to China. They bought weapons from Russia. They invited Iranian engineers to fix their refineries. In a normal world, the US could tolerate this. But in 2026, we do not live in a normal world. We live in a world where the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve is empty. We live in a world where US shale production has peaked. And crucially, we live in a world where the US debt-to-GDP ratio is 135%. When you owe $36 trillion, you need assets to back that debt. You cannot back it with paper. You cannot back it with good vibes. You need hard assets. Washington looked at the map. They saw the biggest pile of black gold in the world sitting just a 3-hour flight from Miami, and they decided, we are taking it back. But why now? Why January 2026? Why not last year? Why not 5 years ago? Because of the BRICS financial switch. Intelligence reports indicated that Maduro was about to sign a definitive treaty with Beijing to join the new financial order. To understand why this terrified Washington, you have to understand the weapon the BRICS alliance has built. It is a new settlement layer called the unit. Unlike the US dollar, which is backed by debt and promises, the unit is backed 40% by physical gold and 60% by a basket of commodities, oil, wheat, and also gas. They built a digital rail called M-Bridge that allows central banks to trade this currency directly, completely bypassing the US banking system and SWIFT. China pays Venezuela in gold-backed units. Venezuela uses those units to buy factories from China or wheat from Russia. The US dollar is never touched. If Venezuela, the holder of the world's largest oil reserves, had officially priced its oil in the unit, the demand for US dollars would have collapsed. The US would lose the exorbitant privilege of printing money to buy energy. They would have to pay for oil in gold, and the US does not have enough gold to cover its consumption. This was a mathematical red line. Operation Absolute Resolve wasn't launched to save the Venezuelan people from a dictator. It was launched to stop the Chinese from turning off the dollar tap. The official narrative versus reality. Now let's step back and look at the story they are feeding you. This is the most critical part of understanding the Great Reset. You must learn to translate State Department English into economic reality. Narrative 1. The War on Drugs. Turn on CNN or Fox News right now. What do you hear? Maduro is a narco-terrorist. The cartel of the Suns. We are invading to stop the flow of fentanyl and cocaine into American suburbs. This is the moral cover. They parade the Department of Justice indictment of Maduro. They show you seized bricks of cocaine. But let's look at the facts. According to the USDA's own data, 92% of the cocaine entering the United States comes from Colombia. Colombia is an ally. The US have military bases there and give them billions in aid. If we were invading countries to stop drugs, we would have invaded Bogota 10 years ago. We don't invade allies who produce drugs. We invade enemies who price oil in yuan. The narco-state label is a marketing slogan designed to make you feel good about seizing a sovereign nation's resources. It turns a pirate raid into a police action. Narrative 2. Restoring democracy. The White House press secretary stood at the podium yesterday and said, "We are here to return power to the Venezuelan people." She talked about free and fair elections and a humanitarian corridor. Let's look at the economic reality. Who is sitting in the presidential palace in Caracas right now? Is it a democratically elected leader? No, it is a transitional council hand-picked by the US State Department. And who are the advisors to this council? They are former executives from the Venezuelan oil industry who have been living in Houston for the last 20 years, working for American oil majors. They aren't writing a new constitution. They are writing a new foreign direct investment law. The draft of this law, which leaked this morning, removes the requirement for PDVSA, the state oil company, to own 51% of all oil projects. It allows 100% foreign ownership. This isn't about giving Venezuela back to the Venezuelans. It is about giving the Orinoco Belt to ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. Democracy is the brand. Privatization is the product. Narrative 3. Reconstruction aid. You are going to hear a lot about aid packages in the coming weeks. The US pledges $50 billion to rebuild Venezuela. It sounds generous. It sounds like the Marshall Plan. It is actually a debt trap. The US bombed the infrastructure on Monday. On Friday, the US will lend them the money to fix it. But that money comes with strings. It comes from the IMF and the World Bank. To get the money, Venezuela must agree to structural adjustments. They must cut pensions, they must privatize water, and most importantly, they must pledge their future oil revenue to pay back the loan. The US are locking Venezuela into a debt cycle that will last for 50 years. The oil that flows out of the ground in 2030, 2040, and 2050 is already spent. It belongs to the creditors in New York. The US didn't liberate the country, they leveraged it. This is the difference between the news and the truth. The news tells you it's a battle of good versus evil. The truth is that it's a hostile corporate takeover where the shareholders are the American people holding the debt, and the target company is Venezuela. The military is just the hostile acquisitions department. So, what happens now? The first thing the new government will do is ramp up production. Within 90 days, you will see Chevron and Exxon engineers repairing the rigs. They will dredge the ports, and the oil will start flowing again. But it won't be flowing to China. It will be flowing to the US Gulf Coast refineries. These refineries, in Texas and Louisiana, were specifically built in the 1990s to process heavy Venezuelan crude. They have been starving for this specific type of oil for 5 years. Now, the feed line is reconnected. This secures US energy independence for another decade. But the revenue, it won't go to the Venezuelan people. It will go to pay off the reconstruction loans. It is the perfect closed loop. It is Colony 2.0. No flags, just contracts. So what is China's next move? This brings us to the most dangerous part of the video. The United States has just seized China's energy security. China loaned Venezuela $60 billion over the last decade to build those oil fields. That money is gone. The new US-installed government will declare it odious debt and refuse to pay. China has been humiliated. So what do? Do they start World War III over Venezuela? No, China does not fight wars. It can't win. They cannot beat the US Navy in the Caribbean. Instead, they will execute the symmetric response. This is the principle of an eye for an eye. The US took China's energy security, so China will take the US's technology security. Target 1: the Taiwan quarantine. Watch the Taiwan Strait closely in the next 72 hours. China doesn't need to invade Taiwan and blow up the chip factories, TSMC. That would hurt them too. They simply need to execute a customs quarantine. They will announce that. Due to security concerns, all ships entering or leaving Taiwan must be inspected by the Chinese Navy. This stops the flow of advanced microchips to the United States. Without TSMC chips, Apple stops. Nvidia stops. The US military supply chain stops. It is the ultimate leverage. You unblock our oil, we unblock your chips. Target 2. The financial nuclear option. China currently holds roughly $700 billion in US Treasury bonds. Historically, they feared dumping them because it would hurt their own currency. But now, the gloves are off. If China dumps $700 billion of US debt onto the market in a single week, the US bond market crashes. US interest rates would spike from 5% to 15% overnight. Every bank in America would become insolvent, just like Silicon Valley Bank, but all at once. The US housing market would freeze instantly. It would cause a financial heart attack in the American economy. China is signaling, you can have the oil, but we will destroy your banking system. This is asymmetric warfare. The US fights with marines and missiles. China fights with supply chains and bond yields. The US just punched them in the face. China are about to stab them in the wallet. The invasion of Venezuela is the desperate act of a dying empire trying to secure its retirement fund. It is a repo man operation on a national scale. The US didn't liberate Venezuela, they repossessed it. It is the beginning of a nightmare for the American middle class. Americans might be cheering for Team America right now. They might think cheap gas is coming, but you need to look at the second-order effects. Because in geopolitics, for every action, there is an equal and opposite financial reaction. 1. The end of cheap goods, China's retaliation. The US just stole China's energy security. Do you think they will keep sending US cheap iPhones, cheap clothes, and cheap electronics? The US-China rivalry just went from a Cold War to a hot economic war. China will retaliate not with missiles, but with supply chains. They will restrict the export of rare earth metals, which they control 90% of. They will throttle the supply of pharmaceutical ingredients, which they control 80% of. The Walmart economy, where you could live a middle-class life on a stagnant wage because goods were cheap, is over. Get ready for supply shock inflation. Prices won't just go up, products will simply vanish from the shelves. 2. The interest rate bomb war is expensive. Occupation is expensive. Reconstruction is expensive. The US government is going to print trillions of dollars to fund this operation. But who buys the debt? China used to buy the US debt. Now they are the enemy. Japan is selling the US debt to save the yen. Saudi Arabia is selling the US debt to buy gold. If nobody buys the debt, the Federal Reserve must act as the buyer of last resort. This causes yield curve control. It means inflation is going to rip higher, 10%, 15%, maybe 20%. And if the Fed tries to fight it by raising rates, they will blow up the housing market. 3. The housing market crash. This is the hidden link. If China dumps their $700 billion in US treasuries to punish us for Venezuela, US mortgage rates will spike overnight. Imagine waking up tomorrow and the 30-year fixed mortgage is 12%. The value of your home would collapse by 30 to 40% instantly. Refinancing becomes impossible. Home equity lines of credit freeze. The wealth effect that keeps the American economy spending would evaporate. The US just secured the oil, but might have sacrificed the housing market to do it. 4. And finally, the darkest reality, the draft. We are entering a period of total conflict. The US military is now an active combatant in South America, the Middle East, and potentially East Asia. They need bodies. If they don't institute a military draft, they will institute an economic draft. This means austerity, Social Security slashed to pay for tanks, Medicare gutted to pay for aircraft carriers. Americans' tax dollars are no longer for themselves, they are for the empire. Americans are being conscripted economically to fund a war machine that protects Exxon's profits, not their borders. The invasion of Venezuela was a tactical success, but a strategic suicide. The US proved they can still conquer a nation, but also proved to the world, to China, to Russia, to India, to the global south, that the United States is no longer a partner. They are the real predator. And when you act like a predator, the rest of the herd unites against you. The United States of America just pushed the world into two distinct camps, the dollar bloc and the gold bloc, the consumer bloc and the producer bloc. The US have the aircraft carriers, China have the factories and the gold. Historically, the factories and the gold always win in the end. The oil is flowing to Texas, but the wealth is flowing out of your pocket. The US is repossessing Venezuela, but in the process, they may have just defaulted on the American dream. Like and subscribe if you want to know how to shield your wealth before the Chinese retaliation hits the bond market.